different than some of our others. Some of you may have watched parts of the show Ugly Delicious that we'll be talking a bit about. Very interesting show. I should have given a disclaimer about some of the language, but you're all adults. I want to introduce a good friend of mine, Matt Bridges. Matt and I met in seminary, at seminary orientation, and have been friends ever since. Matt lives in Durham. He's one of the teachers at the Trinity School, and he teaches humanities in the upper school.
Theology.
And theology in the upper school. I feel like I'm introducing a Hogwarts professor every time I introduce him. And Matt is going to help facilitate our conversation today. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. One of the great things about being here, my family and I have a history here. We've worshiped here before. Justin and I have been friends for a long time. The first time we met was over some cheap pizza in the basement of the Div School. But ever since, we have indulged one another with food. We meet over food all the time. We tell each other where the good food is, and every once in a while we make food for us. It's intimidating, but I've made brisket for this Texan.
Yes, it's quite good.
And tacos as well. So we've been friends for a long time, and one of the great things about our friendship is that there are levels of honesty, and then there are real levels of honesty. And those sorts of things come from having a long friendship together, spending, up 2 a.m. studying Greek at a Mexican restaurant, and a number of those sorts of experiences. So one of the things that I'm hopeful comes out of this, and Toby's friendship with all of you, is that one of the things that's interesting about Ugly Delicious is that who you eat with matters. And so there's a lot packed into that. There's a lot that we can talk about. But I thought we should start with a couple questions to the two of you, and maybe I'll chime in as well. But tell us about the best meal that you ever had, and why it was that, and maybe who you were eating with.
Oh my goodness, this is a hard one.
I'm going to fill in.
Okay, go.
My dad did his whole career as a food scientist at NC State.
Oh, wow.
And he loves to travel, and he travels all over the world and has for a long time. So I grew up eating all kinds of really different food. And then on top of that, my baby brother is adopted from Peru. And as y'all know, my husband's family is from Vietnam. So the variety of food in our house has entered in with my dad's experiences, but also with the people who have come into our family. But one of the things I've been searching really hard for here in Chapel Hill, so both sides of my family are from Texas, and I've been looking for good tortillas since we moved to Chapel Hill, to find a place that's going to make them fresh. Ideally, 2 minutes before I eat them would be best. But hunting that down has been quite difficult here in Chapel Hill. And I was thinking about that this morning, and thinking about the best tortillas that I ever had. So this is not a meal, but one item. I used to work with migrant farm workers in North Carolina and Florida, and I would migrate back and forth between here and Florida with the growing seasons. And my first fall here in North Carolina, the kids in the Head Start program where I was working, they all started to turn orange. Their skin literally was turning orange. And come to find out, it was sweet potato harvest time. And sweet potatoes was the majority of what these families had, what they were gleaning from the fields, and that's what they were feeding their kids. And they were feeding so many sweet potatoes that you could tell the beta carotene was coming through in their skin color. So I started visiting homes of these families to talk to them about what their needs were and help connect them with resources in the community so that they had some more variety in their children's diet. And when I would sit down in a kitchen, any kitchen, as soon as I sat down, they would pull out masa and they would make tortillas there for me as I sat in the kitchen. And it was the only thing they had to offer me was a tortilla. And those were the best tortillas that I've ever eaten. And part of the reason that they're the best is because they were fresh and they were made by hands that could have made them with their eyes closed. But the other reason is because there was a story that went with it. People and a kind of giving that was unique and beautiful.
Right.
I'm going to offer two stories. One, because the first one deals with tortillas as well. We kind of take up a different theme. So growing up in middle school and then much of high school, I had a good friend. My best friend in those times was his family's from Mexico, and so he's first generation. When I would go over to Edward's house, his mother would not let me eat unless I said something coherent to her in Spanish. And so every now and then my son will ask me, my eldest son will ask me how I remember so much Spanish. It's because I had to eat. And it made it more special. And so I knew that we were going to be at his home. I'd be at his home at least a couple times a week. And in order to eat a meal, I had to share in language, and it was a very rich experience that I will never forget. The first time I can remember working for my food in a certain kind of a way. The other was, and I've told a story about South Korea before, but I happened to be in South Korea with a Catholic priest who was there because the World Methodist Council was doing this Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist reconciliation around the doctrine of justification. So Cardinal Ratzinger was one of the people there, and with him was this priest named Donald Boland, who worked at the Vatican at the time. Now I believe he's an archbishop, or some such. And so we decided we were going to go out. We just met one another, and we were going to eat in Seoul, but we wanted to find a very kind of authentic neighborhood restaurant. And so we went not knowing what we were doing and found a restaurant. Didn't exactly know how to order, but we determined that we were going to order something and we were going to eat it. No matter what it was, we were going to eat it and eat all of it. And so we did, and the food kept coming. And it kept coming. We thought we did not order this much food, but it kept coming. And finally we both said, we've got to end. We've got to tap out. We cannot eat anymore. And it wasn't until later that we learned that was a part of Korean hospitality, that there should always be an abundance. There should always be leftovers. That's how you know you're a good host, if there are leftovers. And it was such a treat. We learned the hard way, and I'm pretty sure we suffered for the rest of the day. But also just another experience, not only because of the kinship that it developed in between these two folks who didn't really know one another, but also because of what we learned about the nature of hospitality.
I'll share just one real quick story. This story is important to my story with food. And when I was in college, I roomed with 3 other young men, and we decided, foolishly enough, that we were going to share meals 4 nights a week, and then Friday nights was, you do whatever you want. It was foolish in part because none of us knew how to cook. One of the things I decided was, what if I, did something interesting and I just bought myself a Weber charcoal grill, and I taught myself how to grill. And so every Tuesday night, I would fire up the grill, and I bought myself a book, Stephen Reichland, who's I think from North Carolina, his Barbecue Bible, which I would commend to you. And I started working my way through the recipes of this book. And one of them was super complicated. It required you to smoke a tomato so that the skin broke, and then you took that smoked tomato, and then you turned it into a cream sauce, and then you used, planked salmon and all this, super complicated for me, not being a very good, knowing how to cook at all. This was a very complex item to do. I tackled it though, I did it, and I realized two things. One, that if I imagined what I wanted the thing to taste like beforehand, then oftentimes I could make that happen. Very practical. But the other thing I realized is when I cooked good food, my roommates knew that I loved them. There was a sense that I was giving them something that was maybe a little bit harder to communicate between, four bros in an apartment during college, but I could communicate that by giving them, some food that actually came from my hands instead of the, Stouffer's or, fried potatoes, or I don't even want to tell you what I ate from my other friends, but all three of these stories have to do with our relationships with people across the table from us, right? Which is, I think, a great way to start to transition to talk about what Ugly Delicious communicated a little bit about food, and then we can talk a little bit about race, and then maybe race and the question of the church. And we should not mistake, the iconography right here, where, we're sitting here right in front of, the table of our Lord, as we're trying to talk about the question of race, even right before an election. And so there's all sorts of things happening that make this sort of moment really packed with some meaning. So one of the things that comes through Ugly Delicious all the way is that food is not just fuel, but food has this kind of web of connections. Right. And maybe without prompting you too much, what were some of the connections or webs of things that you were most interested in from the show that you want to talk about a little bit?
Go ahead. I don't have it yet. You don't have it yet? Because I might talk about your thing. That's okay. Right. So so clearly I love the show, otherwise I wouldn't have recommended folks watch it. Every episode, what I enjoyed about it was, so there's this food that you know and can recognize and have likely had at a certain point in your life, and you learned about a context that it was being cooked in. You learned about its origins. You learned about the innovations around that food, and so in many cases, the food crosses continents and cultures, and so I think that web of connection was very interesting. I think about the episode about crawfish, and it certainly, they talked about Houston, and so one can imagine why I enjoyed it. And I've been longing for crawfish for a little while now, and crawfish boil season I kind of missed. So this idea about what happens in Vietnam that then connects with New Orleans, that then connects with Houston, and also this challenge around, I might get into some of the conversation about race there, but just even this challenge around race. So it's not only can one innovate around crawfish in a different place, but what does it mean for Vietnamese fishermen to be present in the Gulf Coast, and then have the legislators say, now these folks need to be able to fish, and for America to be protected by the KKK, because those were the only folks who would make sure that these Vietnamese fishermen could not fish. really intense network of connection when, originally I was just thinking, no, I think this kind of Vietnamese take on crawfish is amazing. But it really had this broader network of connection. So.
And then piggybacking on that it goes back to Vietnam too, right? So it goes back to an origin, but it's something else in that origin.
Right.
And the idea that that changes can be made and developed and maybe improved upon because of the other things that it's come contact with, and then it can move back to the place that it came from and still be appreciated in that place for what it brings.
Yeah, it was striking to me in the episode, they put the Mekong Delta, a picture of it right next to the Mississippi Delta, and showed how similar they were and why the same sort of creatures were taken from that same place and used in sort of culinary food. One of the things that was interesting, it was in that same conversation, they were talking about what crawfish are, and they're these like terrible, ugly bottom feeders that eat the junk in freshwater rivers when they meet ocean. But they were, when you take them and you cook them in a certain way, they are a tradition, right? They are delicious. They are, late night food. They are, all these different things. These are some of the ugliest creatures that God has ever made. But they have these, really interesting stories that connect people. Tell me a little bit about, one of the things that was interesting is in that same episode, this woman, a white woman, said that Houston is one of the most accepting cities in the United States. And I'd be happy for those people who know Houston well to say that that's true or not true, and we can talk about that.
We're going to call it true.
Right. Houston is one of the most accepting places in the U.S., in part because, and I think the quote is, because we eat each other's food.
Right.
Can you guys talk a little bit about that? And like that movement from, okay, we have a cook, we have a food, and now we have that are connected, and now we have a connection across a table, I guess.
Right. Let me just tell a couple stories about Houston, because I have a few. Many of you know Houston is where I grew up. Houston is statistically America's most diverse city, and the campus of the church that I served was in the most diverse neighborhood of the most diverse city in the country. And so was swimming in that kind of a conversation. Some of you know that between Houston and here, we lived in Nashville for 3 years. And I remember when we moved, so this 4.5 years ago now, we moved. We'd gone through the airport, and we were in Nashville. And in fact, we were actually looking for a house. And we were in the airport. I had all of my family and my mother-in-law, who's a real estate agent. And my task was just to get them in the car so we could get to the hotel. And so we get in the car, and Zan says to me, "Where are all the other kinds of people?" And I said, "No, I've just gotten everything in the back. I'm a little less Pastor Justin in the moment. I'm just trying to get out of there." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Where were the other kinds of people in the airport?" And then what he was meaning to say is he didn't see people of color in the airport in the way that he'd known, because in Houston, in the parts of town that we went, and we had relatives that lived all around town, you couldn't go into a space without hearing another language, sometimes even multiple languages, seeing people of various different races and ethnicities. And so that was all around him. His church life was that there was no ethnic majority in the campus of the church that I served. And so, this was his school life. And so there's this sense that by necessity, one of the city council men would always say that the part of Houston that we lived in was kind of like the Ellis Island of the South, because so many people would move right there and then begin to find lives. And so out of necessity, the city had to learn how to be more truly inclusive. And it was not only out of a social necessity, but economic necessity, because in Houston, if you're going to drive, so economics drive things. And so inclusivity, we'd like to say, is because of the, enlightened Texas something, but we know Texans. So it's really about economic necessity, and they, folks wanted businesses to hum. And so, greater inclusion allowed for that. And then sometimes you find a diverse racial ethnic inclusion. Now, it's not a perfect place. Clearly, I could name many, many stories in which all of these cultures and ethnicities clashed, even in the church, in painful ways. But there are also ways, I think, to celebrate. And so if you live in proximity to one another, if you like food, you end up eating in all of these different places with people who are your friends, who are inviting you to out-of-the-way places that have the best this or the best that. And over time, it begins to affect the town. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Gosh, it's hard to narrow down a story. I'm sure y'all have stories floating through your head too about what it means to eat somebody else's food. My husband grew up in a Vietnamese home, and when his family would gather together for Thanksgiving, it was all Asian dishes that would be brought for Thanksgiving. There was no turkey or anything like that. It was noodles and rice dishes and all kinds of stuff. But one aunt would bring just a massive bowl, I'm not lying when I say it's this big, of mashed potatoes. And that was Jimmy's very favorite thing at Thanksgiving, this massive bowl of mashed potatoes. The first Thanksgiving that he spent with our family, I told my mom about it ahead of time. And we have sweet potatoes in our family for Thanksgiving because that's what's right to do. And my mom put mashed potatoes on the table that year for Jimmy for Thanksgiving. And she has every year since. And this last year, I was urging my parents to minimize what they were putting on the table. I think one of them had had surgery on a knee and the other on a foot, and I knew I was going to have to clean all the dishes. So I said, let's just choose one potato. And my mom looked at me, and she gave me that mother look when you know you've done something wrong. And she said, no, this is what makes Thanksgiving for Jimmy, and he's part of this family. And sure enough, we had mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes again last year, and I imagine that we will this year and every year after this, because it is important to eat somebody else's food. It brings a piece of them, and somehow you embody that piece of them when you eat their food.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. Every dish has a mind behind it. For every food that we eat, there is a chef. Now, that chef might be, the person with the "I'm loving it" thing on their shirt. That might be the mind behind your meal as you're rushing someplace else. It may be, down here at 411 West, or, if you want really good pizza, a little bit further down in Carborough to Mercado. That could be fancier, or at home, it's a family member who is the chef. It is, or maybe it's yourself, and you have this sense of, you're conscious of what you're putting into the dish, not only ingredients, but, a little bit of yourself. Tell me a little bit about the people behind the dishes, a little bit for the two of you, and what it is you take when a family member or a chef or just so that we get a sense of one of those connections before. Yeah.
Yeah. I think when I think about growing up in the Coleman household, my mom was the primary cook. My mom, for the most part, when I was growing up, stayed in the home and managed the work of the home, and she was the primary cook. And Mom would say she often watches us via live streaming, so hi, Mom. Forgive me for some of this. But my mother was very utilitarian about her cooking. It was, we're cooking, we're eating to live here, not to make fancy dishes here. So she had this array of things that she would make, but her mother never wanted folks in the kitchen. So she didn't observe that, and so she just kind of made it up along the way. My dad hardly ever cooked 363 days out of the year. But when it came to Thanksgiving and when it came to Christmas, stay out of the way because it was Austin Coleman's kitchen. And he would labor over stuff and want you to taste it and kind of delight in your enjoyment of it. And that's always stuck with me. And so I do cook quite a bit more than Austin Coleman now, but I still carry a lot of that delight in it. My eldest brother, who didn't live in the home with us, Austin Jr., is the same way. Austin's 15 years older than I am, and so he was, younger when my dad was in the house with him. It was my dad's first marriage, but Austin is the same way, and so some of that may be genetic, but some of it I think is just what we remember of our dad and emulate on a much more regular basis, at least 50% of the year. So we're upping the percentage. But that was cooking in my household. Mostly something that you had to do. We did it around the table. There wasn't much pomp and circumstance except for those couple times of the year.
My dad did the majority of the cooking growing up. He never used a recipe, though, which means that if it was really good, you were never going to get to taste it again, because who knows how it was put together. And if it was really bad, you were never going to have to taste it again. My mom had a couple of dishes that were her signature dishes, still are, though she doesn't make them. Mother, you should make them. Fried chicken, she makes the best fried chicken on this planet. Her spaghetti sauce is fantastic, and her pie crusts are out of this world. So those are hers that she does well, and she does them consistently, and they taste right. You know your mama's spaghetti sauce. It just tastes right every time. But my dad did the majority of the cooking growing up. And for us, I don't know that I really developed a love of cooking. I love to feed people, though. And I can spend hours in preparation to be ready to feed people, but once they walk through the door, I want to be able to be present with them. So they either need to be in my kitchen while I'm finishing things up, or the food has got to be done. Yeah. I love to feed.
That's nice. I'm sure this happens to all of you as well. You have a dinner party, you invite people over, and you have a great sitting room that you spent all day cleaning, but inevitably everybody ends up in the kitchen talking, and so I'm sure that's happened to you guys as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Interesting. One of the great parts about my life is that I have a wife and kids who all love to cook, and we have enough space in our kitchen for all of us to get our hands dirty. And even with very young children, I see the beginnings of my kids wanting to cook something for their brother or sister and have them enjoy it. which I think they have learned from my wife and I. There are things that my wife and I really differ on. My wife is an excellent cook. She's an excellent baker. And she has very clear ideas about the way she wants dishes to be done. She does not want her scallops to have anything on them except salt and pepper and to be browned in just this certain way. And if I try to do something, like do an interesting, vinegar slaw to put on top of it, she's not having any of that. If you try to put walnuts in your tuna salad, just to try it, and maybe I'm crazy. That's fine. You can look at me like that. That's fine. I tried it once, but she's not having any of that either. Our relationship, has this sort of back and forth in which we can try new things, and our kids are trying new things, and so when that happens, it's a really beautiful moment in our sort of family. I wonder if we can sort of pivot just a little bit to talk about race, now that we've sort of established some of the strong pulls that food has on us. And, there was that moment in which somebody looked at the camera in Ugly Delicious and said that, food is powerful. And there were a couple moments that I saw myself in Ugly Delicious, and a couple moments that I was particularly wondering about asking Justin as an African American. And I wanted you particularly to respond to the fried chicken episode.
Yes. Ooh.
Which is super powerful, right?
Yeah.
In which David Chang has all these conversations with some black chefs and black thinkers and black people to try and figure out, in what way is fried chicken this powerful thing? Yeah. And maybe if you can respond this, it seemed to me that by the end of the episode, you saw that fried chicken has this two sides to it. On the one hand, it's a cultural dog whistle, in which people can use to stereotype and to denigrate and to mock black people, has been used to mock black people. But on the other hand, it is something that African Americans have owned, right? And they've said, this is ours, and this marks our story. And we made fried chicken even when we weren't, a whole person, even when we were 3/5 of a person. Right. And that's, that's part of us. I was wondering if you could respond to that as you watched that.
Right. That was a very resonant, thank you for that, Matt. Yeah. It was a very resonant episode because it is about stereotype, which is actually a publishing term from back in the day. You needed to be able to copy things, so you needed stereotype in order to do so more efficiently. And so it has kind of this positive and negative connotation, because there are certain things about stereotype that are true. It comes from a place, but I don't want everyone to name that place. So if someone were to say to me, Justin, clearly you like fried chicken and watermelon, I think this was lifted up in the episode, I want to resist it. But in actuality, I kind of do. It's a delightful pairing. I don't know what that's about, where that's from, but when people assume it of me, I'm offended.
Right. Is it, is it, the assumption that comes, does it matter the race of the person?
Absolutely.
Yeah, say a little bit about
that. If one of my African American family members were to lift it up or something like that, okay, sure, give me the stuff. You got it. I'm gonna eat it. However, if one of y'all assumed it, I'd say, now let's talk about this a bit and how that comes across, even while I was eating what you served me. So it's and I think that's really the frustration is this idea that the African American community is often not as understood as it should be. from primarily the white community. And so there's this sense that anytime somebody who's white says, well, I know this about you, it's, well, why don't you know other things? Why are these the only things, these tropes? Why are these the only ones that you know? And so there's some resisting, or there's this strong desire for nuance. In the episode, there's a lot of conversation that centers around Nashville, a place that I've lived, and fried chicken restaurants, all of which I've eaten at for Nashville hot chicken. And I've experienced the pain of chicken that's too hot there, and also some really delightful experiences. But you have 2 or 3 a hot chicken, so it's kind of a fried chicken restaurants in primarily African American parts of town. And Nashville is a very segregated town in that kind of way. And so for this hot chicken to start there, you really have to go to these African American parts of town in order to take part in the eating of this chicken. Well, then it becomes such a thing. And so when you move to Nashville, one of the things people ask you is, well, what hot chicken places have you eaten at? It's like it's one of these things you ask one another. And so it's been riffed on in so many different ways. And one of the popular places is Hattie B's. Hattie B's is featured in the restaurant in the show. Hattie B's is I think the only place my family has been eating fried chicken. Now, I would roam around with coworkers to some of the hot chicken places nearer to the African American part of North Nashville because it was near our office. And so it was very convenient. Most of these places are within 7 minutes of drive from the office there. But Hattie B's was closer to the parts of town that we lived in. And what you see is that these Hattie B's, a white-owned restaurant, is taking the business from parts of the African American community. So folks don't have to go to some of those historic places anymore. They can receive the version and a safer part of town, a more comfortable part of town. And we call that then the new Nashville experience. And so the challenge there is this thing that is shared. So it's this part of a African American experience in Nashville that is shared and that others are delighting in, which is good. But then there also is this kind of sense of appropriation that is happening, where folks would say, gosh, these folks take our stuff and they like it and they run away with it. And so there's this book called Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy that he talks about transatlantic black life. And so what he says about the United States, I think he taught at Harvard or Yale, I'm trying to remember. And so what Gilroy says about the United States is that African Americans will invent, and then the majority white culture adopts, and then African Americans feel like they need to reinvent. And so here's jazz. Oh, now jazz is yours. Here's hip hop. Oh, well, now hip hop's yours. So we're going to even do more intense hip hop. We're going to wear our stuff a little saggy. Wait, you're wearing it saggy too. We're going to make it even saggier. So it's always this work to make more extreme in order to have some kind of identity that you can say is mine, and we're all celebrating it in such a way that I can still count it as part of my livelihood without having it taken away. And And the challenging part of the episode for me is I saw that. I saw how that business and that work moved outside of the African American community, and even myself, because of proximity and convenience and so many things, thought, well, it's still more convenient to eat in Hattie B's than it is to schlep the family to this other side of town, and so it's a real tension there. I love Hattie B's. I will say it's probably my favorite of the Nashville hot chicken restaurants. But I always want to make sure that those restaurants in the African American community are thriving. So there's a real tension for me in that episode.
And if I could follow up on that, it sounds, if we're going to say that food always tells a story,
right?
It sounds that on the one hand, there are these moves that some white culture has made to take over African American culture, the African American story, to make it more comfortable. Right. On the other hand, it seems that there's an experience of being black in which those things that are supposed to be so life-giving are still very difficult and still very exhausting. Like just eating can't be just eating anymore, but it's a marker, or it's a resistance to a marker, or it's a conversation about the marker. I don't know. Do you want to say something about that?
Absolutely. What you said, exhausting, seems to typify the kinds of conversations, whether it's about food or art or music, whatever it is, and the African American experience, as you have it in a room where African Americans feel like comfortable sharing from that place, or are in a room with primarily African Americans. There is this sense of what is exhausting is trying to protect something, and that goes back really to the fractured nature of black existence in this country in the midst of the slave trade. So, part of the work there was to distance these Africans from their root cultural experiences. So you fracture that, but you also fracture families. And so you're constantly selling family members away from one another. And so post that experience is this constant pursuit to be able to create and name some kind of identity that's intelligible for a community, that a community can celebrate together. But also, I think there's this deep longing for that to be celebrated by other cultures as well. And so what is exhausting is that those gifts, the feeling is those gifts are taken away, not celebrated in the communal context. And so there's this constant moving, fluid effort to create some sense of what is the African American common experience here in the United States. And the only thing that you can name as common is pain. That's the only thing that can be named as common. And that is, that's a hard place for a culture to emerge from. And so I think, when you think about what you see and the frustration that you may hear from the African American community, it's really this: how can I create an identity that is commonly celebrated when we try to celebrate, somehow it just causes me more pain. So it feels like pain is the only real thing that I can hold on to.
I think one of the things that I saw myself in, particularly the question of race, is that there is still, I mean, even for well-meaning white people, even for, well-educated, well-meaning white people, there's still a level of ignorance that takes work to unravel. Particularly this identification, and here we have a question of race and Asian American culture, this identification with MSG, with bad food and racism and Asians. There's a scene in the TV show in which, David Chang, who is an Asian American and a journalist, talk about how, ask people what they think about MSG, which is an ingredient in many Asian dishes. And they talk about, well, it means it's bad, or they identify it with, bad cooking or Asian, or, this yucky kind of saltiness, or something that's going to give you cancer, or all those things. And then they hand everybody some junk food, and they say, and they have them eat it, and then they're like, everything we've just given you has MSG in it, and you seem to enjoy that just fine, and yet you don't identify Pringles with, this bad Asians or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And I was convicted in that even well-meaning white folk really need to work hard to unpack our ignorance about all these the difficulty of not only the Asian American experience and the African American experience, but also the ways in which our culture has these like dog whistles and markers built in, that even when I feel like I'm being well-meaning, that can be read as an attempt to me sort of take on a story that's not mine. And one of the things that my friendship with you has taught, even since seminary, is you've taught me to listen really hard to my African American friends, and listen for those things that they are dealing with, and listen for those ways in which my life makes sense like this, and here are the things that are difficult for me, and that posture of listening has really helped me, understand not only you, but also understand, there are those times in which even the most well-meaning person can do something very violent to somebody else's story. So that's Toby, you want to say something about that? Is there something in there that you wanted to react to?
I'm enjoying this conversation. I really am. Good. I mean, it's bringing up little things like as soon as when that happened with that group of people that all have this MSG allergy or whatever, headaches, and it sets and you feel the heaviness of it, like they're just starting to get it. And then this person says, but maybe there's more MSG in the Asian food than there is in these products.
I'm going to double down on my racism.
Yeah. But also thinking about that posture of listening, that's one of the things I love about the host of this show, David, is that he was constantly asking people, why is it that you do it this way? I was thinking the fried chicken episode when somebody closes the top right away and he would say, why is that? And they would say it. And then the next person leaves it open for a couple of seconds and he would ask them why. And he was constantly asking, what does this mean to you? Why is this important? Why is it that you're doing this? And he shows us that posture of listening that you're talking about.
In an interview that he did before the show was released, he said something to the effect, these are not his words, but it was this same general idea that food is one of the only uninterrogated areas of racism in our country's life. So we are trying to interrogate racism in so many ways, but you can talk about MSG, and know who's interrogating that, which was lovely because I remember as a kid, our favorite takeout spot was this Chinese restaurant, and it was around the corner from the house, and we'd go all the time, and the kids of the restaurant owners went to school with us, and it was this delightful experience. But I remember when my folks went through their no MSG thing, and so they'd always say no MSG. I didn't even know what it was, other than it could probably kill me, and it was really, really bad. And so I don't think I've ever said no MSG in my adult life, but that's stuck in the back of my mind as this bad thing that happens in this food that I enjoy until this episode. And I thought, that is fascinating. And the levels of it that you see in other foods, absolutely fascinating. And I'd never, as one who talks about race, and in Houston, a good part of that work was constantly working through issues of race. And here is an area totally uninterrogated in my life. And so it was, I think we all need those eye-opening moments.
Yeah. I think this is a great moment to segue to talking about the gospel. And I'm struck, by the connection of food, and I think the logical place would be good to go to talk about Christianity and race is to talk about communion. And did you guys have communion today?
We did.
You did. Okay, so one of the things, I had communion at my church. I go to Blackmore Presbyterian, and one of the things that my pastor says all the time is that Jesus is the host of this table. And there's a story about in Ugly Delicious in which David Chang goes to this hot chicken place. He goes late at night. He goes unaccompanied. He ignorantly says, "I can eat anything you give me." And they giggle, and they're like, "Okay, here's the hottest thing we can make." And he goes through a very terrible experience. And then he comes back, and he's sitting down with Sean Brock, who's a white man, and the chef, who is a black woman, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to order your chicken again, but I want you to teach me how to eat." Right? Yeah. And I think that's what happens for Christians when we take communion, right? Jesus stands in front of this table right here and says, "Okay, I'm going to teach you all how to eat," right? And so communion is the right place to talk about this, the right place to talk about racism as well, in part because communion, I think, and maybe I'll get you guys to reflect on this a little bit, communion, and I'm going to riff on what you just said, is supposed to interrogate our lives and our hearts, right? When you come up begging for sustenance, for the body and the blood of Jesus, that there's an interrogation that happens. Jesus reads our hearts. Do you guys want to react to that a little bit?
You know you want to, Toby.
I do. I'll follow you.
Yeah, it's so one of the things that I often say is that my spirituality is at its core Eucharistic, and so the things that I talk about love of God and neighbor, the things that I talk about related to kinship or inclusivity or whatever else I'll talk about in the Christian life can all come back to the table. And it might be a weird thing about me, maybe one of the ways that I am kind of extreme in my thinking, but this table, so baptism as a sacrament and communion as a sacrament absolutely rigorously define my life. And so I don't always live up to the high standards of either sacrament, but absolutely defines my life. And so when you say, who should I include or who should I exclude, who's included at the table? And as much as I don't like them, don't want them, rather not, if Christ would include them at the table, I have to. And I'm not always happy about it. But I do it anyway. And because of that, and even how I think about forgiveness, and so there's this practice in the life of the church that you don't commune until you're reconciled with whoever that you have. There's enmity between you, and so there are times in my life where I've taken this very seriously, and it's odd for a pastor not to commune because you'd notice it. Now y'all are going to be looking from now on. Oh, he didn't take it. Something's going on. So it means something. So therefore, I've got to really do the work to create some sense of reconciliation, to ask for forgiveness or to offer it so that I can come to this table with a clean heart, clean conscience, ready to receive all that God has for me. And I do it because it's interrogating my life. And so in this way, I think that the communion table should interrogate the life of all Christians. When we think about the great forms of exclusivity that the church knowingly or unknowingly performs, then I wonder, have we allowed this table to interrogate our lives? Or do we have a view of the table? Have we created a story around the table that says, it's exclusive, therefore I can be as well? And I think that is too often the case. Christianity that is very concerned with knowing that there are people who can't be in, therefore I'm justified in my saying you can't be in. And I think that's a real challenge for the life of faith.
Mm-hmm. That loops us back around to the conversation about food that has a story, and how that makes it unique. And the story that we tell about communion, we have to get that story right, and we have to continue to tell it every single week when we come together to remind ourselves of who we are at this table and who we're meant to be.
Right.
I mean, I'm struck, both of you mentioning the story and the interrogation. I think isn't that what's happening in 1 Corinthians 11, in which Paul says, you guys say that you're Christians, but you're making the poor folk eat out in the hall while you get drunk at the banquet table. That's not what love is. So you need to get reconciled together, all eat at the same table, otherwise you shouldn't eat, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, he says, when Jesus broke bread, he said, do this in remembrance of me. He tells the story in that same moment. I think you guys both picked up on both those things, which I think are crucial to understanding what's happening at the table.
Well, and it reminds me of something else from Ugly Delicious as well. So this idea of class comes up, and we can't quite separate our thoughts about race and from our thoughts about class as well. So it's a pizza episode. Now, some of you who were at our potluck that we had before this may have noted that there was some Domino's pizza there. It was for a reason, because Domino's was talked about.
So did David Chang deliver it?
David Chang did not deliver it. That would have made it even more special. So, so David Chang is a popular restaurateur, and I think I was reading that at one of his restaurants, he both has high-end restaurants and what you might think of as low-end, more common restaurants. And I think there is a dish, oh my goodness, I can't remember how much it cost, a few $100s worth of something at a restaurant. And so he certainly knows how to do a high-end dish that we all want to go in together to buy. But here's a guy who also loves Domino's pizza. And he says that he loves it because it was the meal that he would eat with his brother when they were watching football.
Right.
And so it goes back to home. We're always kind of returning home in a kind of a way in our for comfort or for what gives us joy in life. And so he likes Domino's because that's what he had. And he says, if I'd started out eating some kind of higher grade fancy pizza, I may have never had that experience, but now I learned that I can love both. And what frustrates him about people who say, no, I can only eat pizza from this kind of spot, and who look down upon Domino's, is the inherent classism that's in food. And he believes that food unites people, the
Right.
table unites people, rather than separates people. And so what you have in 1 Corinthians there is this sense that food, it's becoming this Domino's thing. It is separating people. People of a higher class are able to commune, and there just simply aren't the leftovers for the people who are poor. So there's class, there's economics in that, and that's absolutely what Paul says. So you eat to your own condemnation in that, and so that's eating in such a way that leads to death, a kind of a spiritual death. And Paul's trying to talk about a way that eating that leads to life and the reintegration of community and the removal of these dividing walls. I mean, I think it's a powerful message that Paul's trying to convey there. And then I think, in ways, David is trying to convey in the show.
Well, I want to ask one more question, and this is important for both the pastors of this congregation to answer this about communion and what communion, our practice of communion rituals, says about race and what the church ought to look like. In other words, if Christians eat like this, then who are we supposed to be? And then the last question, and then we want to open it up for questions, right?
Yeah.
The last question is I want you to send us out to eat as Christians out in the world. Like, how should Christians eat out there if we eat like this in here?
Yes.
So why don't you guys answer that first question, a little bit about the question of race and communion, and then we'll give us some advice, some Christian advice on how to go forth and eat as Jesus would have us.
Mm-hmm.
So won't you be thinking about advice, and I'm going to take the first one.
Okay.
So what is true about me as a Christian, and I'll try not to be emotional about this, is that I've mostly eaten at segregated tables. There may be things that culturally create that. No one's said the table has to be segregated, but I've mostly eaten at segregated tables because most of the churches that I've been a part of have been either white or black. I mean, it's kind of gone back and forth in many of the communities that I've been a part of across my life. It's an open table. In the Methodist tradition, all are welcome to the table. The table theologically is meant to express in our tradition this impulse to go out and to include and to invite people in to eat around the table with you. But in many cases, I've not had radically inclusive tables other than, a few folks here and a few folks there. One of the profound things that happened to our church in Houston that was at the core of its transformation experience was meant to be this creation of a multinational community. And so that was at the core of the mission. So we worked hard, very hard at it. We were focused in it, and in every meeting you were in, people were focused on that very hard task. And the table was, it was almost twice as long as our table is here, and the altar rail was in an oval shape. And so you came into the chancel and you knelt at the altar, and so you could always see people across from you. And I remember the first time we gathered, and the community just looked robustly diverse, and people wept at the altar. I mean, it's hard for me to think about it without weeping myself, because it. I remember my associate pastor saying, Pastor Justin, it looks like the kingdom. And so every now and then, she's Bolivian, and she and her husband do missions. They're now living in Bolivia with her parents, who were her mother, who's ill. But every now and then, she will tag me in a picture to post on Facebook, and invariably it's a picture around the table. And she never says it. She never comments about it. I mean, she's often in the picture, so it's part just remembering, the fun times in ministry. But it's also a reminder of that picture, of the people, of the kingdom, of what happens if you work hard, if a community dedicates its life to something. And let me say, it's struggle. It's struggle and pain. It's a beautiful picture, but it's struggle and pain, because communities have to do what they don't want to do and make room. And it's hard to make room for people culturally. It's hard to make room because it means that your preferences in certain ways must adjust in order to make room, or you have to do something uncomfortable and open yourself up in a different way. And so, again, every now and then she'll just tag me and to remind me of that experience without any other commentary. And, one could argue it's easier to do that in the most diverse neighborhood in the country. And if that's easy, I got to tell you, I don't want to know what hard looks like. But nevertheless, I do think it's a picture of the kingdom of God, and it is a picture that is replicable in actually most communities, because many communities and towns like ours, just watch who's walking up and down Franklin Street, and that shows you that kind of life around the table is possible. But the community has to dedicate its life to it. Is my sense.
Yeah. It's just to flag that thing. It looks, when your associate said it looks like the kingdom, she's talking about the now, but she's also talking about the hope that Christians have. Yeah. She's talking about the future in which heaven is going to look like a banquet table, right? And eating like this anticipates eating like that. And so in that moment, right, for Christians, that little slice of heaven, no pizza pun intended, comes here and meets us, right? And we get to partake in that little bit of heaven.
Yeah. I mean, it's, one until Christ comes again and we feast at the heavenly banquet. I mean, we say this in the communion liturgy. It's that picture of what it means to feast at the heavenly banquet with all the people of God gathered. So,
yeah.
One summer during Field Ed, I served this little tiny church just north of Pittsburgh and south of here. And there was this little old lady in her 90s, Miss Navida, who happens to be the mother-in-law of Bill Gaddis, who had been making the communion bread in that church that worships, maybe 25 people for 40 years from the same starter. So every time they had communion, it was from the same starter. And I wondered what it was like to take care of that starter, feed it, and then you have to take something from it, right, in order to keep it going. And to do that week after week for 40 years and the kind of dedication that it took. And this is some of the dedication that it took. She didn't for a while. Her starter died. But somebody else in the church, she had previously given some of that starter to.
Nice.
And they had that starter at their house. And so for that period of time, when she didn't have any starter, it was this other person that she had given some of it to that made the bread until it came back into her home for her to make it. And I think that's something we come to the table with our hands extended out, empty, waiting to be given bread. We don't take it from the person that's handing it to us. Our hands come empty. And it's daily bread that we have here. It's a tortilla that just came off of the skillet. It's not birthday cake that we have in this place. And then it gives us nourishment for the work that we do. And I think some of that work happens in two other tables. It happens at our kitchen tables with the people that we draw into our own home and other homes that we go to. And it happens out in the mission table too, when we serve other people and then we sit with them also and eat together and learn and share with them.
That's great.
And the only thing I'd tag on to that, and it's far less Toby's much more poetic than I am. You know this as well already. I would say that who you eat with at tables outside of here most often translates to who you eat with at the table here. And so it's important then that our tables in our homes, as we go out with friends, look like the church that we want to see. Because those are the folks who are most likely to show up and dine at this table with you. So.
And maybe in the midst of that eating out there, you have this opportunity, say to the other person, like, teach me how to eat. Right?
Right.
Teach me how to eat.
Yes.
In other words, teach me your story.
Yes. Yes. So, so let's open it up to questions. I don't know if we have a microphone. If Pastor Creighton has a mic there. Any questions you might have for us? Other than, can the church buy some blinds so that you won't be blinded by the light? This is why we don't have afternoon church, by the way, because of the.
It's not so much a question. From some of your earlier talk about eating with people and cultural differences or things that you observe, one of the memories that popped up in my head was from the probably mid-'70s, and a couple of coworkers and I, both, the two of us, were about as pale as the railings here. We became good friends with an African-American woman we worked with who was as dark as your shirts. And we began eating and socializing with her in Durham. And at a time when, as young professional women, we were accustomed to, with trying to, and there were changes in culture at that point, that we expected to be treated the same as men. We thought we'd arrived. That's where we were supposed to be. And one night at a meal at our friend's house, there was a big crowd of people. There were always people in her house. And there was food everywhere. And we stood up to go get in line to fix our plates. And one of the visiting men tapped us on the shoulder and said, "What are you doing? The men have to eat first. And you need to fix that man a plate or that man a plate."
Wow.
Whether we were dating that person or not, it was, and we kind of were taken aback, but we realized that in the culture of that setting of African American people of that time period, the deference was to the men. And that was what we were expected to do if we were going to be a part of that community. And it still strikes, and we sort of went, well, okay, if that's what we're supposed to do, what do you want on your plate? Do you want fried chicken? Do you want macaroni and cheese? Do you want, and we'd fix him a plate, and then we were allowed to fix our own plate. It was different.
Yeah, and it could be, this would be a whole, we'll have to have a part 2 for these conversations about race, but I mean, there could be an extended conversation about, certainly generations, but also how that connects with gender norms in different communities, particularly like, machismo in African American, Latino communities. I mean, there's a lot to be said there. I should just say I'm sorry that you experienced that, but but it's.
It was a learning experience about being in a different cultural
Yeah.
setting
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
than what I was accustomed to.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I've thought about a lot of things. This has been a really interesting conversation about other meals that I've had and other places and so forth. But I had to say something about the fried chicken
Yes.
because one of the best experiences that I've ever had was being on the board of trustees of Bennett College. And I learned so much. But every time we would have a dinner, no matter what it was, we had fried chicken. And my friends there got to know Jan as well. So regardless of when it was or where it was, they always sent fried chicken to Jan. so that was part of his experience, shared experience at a distance. But it was over that fried chicken.
There's this, the talk about fried chicken again reminds me of something that I thought when I'm watching that episode. So, as it relates to, race, but also class. And so, growing up, fried chicken was a thing, but also when we would go to Huntsville, Texas, kind of reunions with family members, there were always people who were going to bring a pot of chitlins. And I have never cared for them. And it was, folks would tease us, oh, you kind of uppity city guy, can't eat chitlins anymore. and I said, no, sure, that's me then, as long as I don't have to eat it. But I never knew a white person who ate chitlins from just in the area that I grew up. I know. Wait, hold on. I mean, this is Texas, and so we were further away from like pig farms and things like that. So you didn't have as much of this. So I remember moving here and having a conversation with Bill Gaddis, he was just hiring me on to be an intern here. And so we were having this conversation about food and about mama dips, and he said, have you tried the chitlins? And I thought, what? I just didn't even know what was happening here. And so his experience as a boy from Bynum all of a sudden connected with my experience of, really working class and sometimes working poor African American families. And we, just saw how class and race kind of clashed and connected in the midst of a conversation, that opened something up for both of us, because he was just so surprised that he'd feasted on them and delighted in them, and I hadn't, and we had this conversation about how that was. And so it's funny the way these things kind of cross and connect, and expand our imaginations.
And fried
Yeah.
chicken is one of these particular things, right? Almost every civilization has learned,
Right. Yeah.
that if you take this bird and you put it in hot oil, it turns delicious.
That's right.
It's every civilization has a fried chicken, and every civilization has a fried dough.
Yes,
And
yes.
it's the way in which those stories intertwine,
Right.
in which fried chicken was a part of the African American story that
Yeah.
begins well before slavery,
Right.
but in slavery too, and how fried chicken becomes also this question about white and class, and now fried chicken is both, on the one hand, low food, right? It's lunchtime food. But you can also go to some of the best restaurants in the Triangle and get fried chicken on the menu. You go to Mandolin in Raleigh, and Sean will make you this delicious chicken and waffles with, and it includes these cider reduced collards, buttermilk fried chicken in buckwheat, and a buckwheat waffle with a mushroom foam. And I remember it so well, in part because it was so delicious. But that's a $40 plate, right? That's a $40 plate, whereas fried chicken for many people is an $8 or $9 lunchtime thing.
Right.
So the stories that fried chicken can tell also intersect in so many
Yes.
interesting different ways.
Yes, and connect us. I mean, so if you go to the Korean fried chicken place here, and then walk a little bit down to the Shanghai dumpling over here, and then go down to Zula's here. I mean, you've got different kinds of fried chicken just along this short expanse here on Franklin Street.
But
Yeah.
don't give me fried chicken if I can't eat it with my fingers.
Yes, ma'am.
If you're going to give me fried chicken, I want to have it in my hand. I don't want anything fancy. Now, I've been sitting here the whole time thinking about being raised in the South. And being raised on food that probably, I don't know where it originated. I don't know whether it originated with the African Americans or with white Southerners, but the food that we ate was cooked probably by the black cooks. I mean, the collards, the fried cornbread, the all the games. I mean, the rabbit and the squirrel, everything. This is, and we ate it and we loved it, and I still love it. And but I've never connected it with racial feelings.
Yeah.
And I it's just interesting to hear you talk about that, Justin. It was food. It was delicious food.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, this whole notion of southern, a kind of a southern cooking or soul food, right? And where does soul food originate? And the feelings of it. I mean, there's this in Houston. There's this spot in Third Ward, which has been African American part of town for many years, generations, and these soul food restaurants in there. You go to those soul food restaurants, they will talk about the other kinds of soul food in other parts of town. I mean, this is our food that other people get to eat, but in those places we don't get to cook it anymore. And how that is, so there's this a pride in an experience that you're remembering, like who's cooking this food, but all of a sudden now we can't even cook it in that restaurant over there. And what does that mean? And the feelings around that. I mean, it's again, it's around, so what am I able to call mine? And then how are we able to name things as ours, and the struggle in the midst of that?
And one of the, if I could just piggyback off that just a little bit, is that the stories that food tells sometimes move without us knowing it, right? You can think about, let's take the oyster, right? In New York City, New Amsterdam, the oyster was as low as it goes. This was free food, basically.
Right.
People used to wheelbarrow oysters up and down the street and sell them for a penny each, right? But then, oysters became a thing in which they became oysters Rockefeller, which were served with martinis in certain ways, right?
Yeah.
But right now, you can get them at your local grocery store, and if you're smart, you know what bay they came from, who farmed them, what you're going to pair with them, what you're going to put on them, and these dishes can change sometimes without us knowing how they have changed. And there's a certain level of eating that if you become conscious of it, and my students I drive my students crazy all the time with this, that it can ruin it, right? I had a student one time, he brought in a fish sandwich from McDonald's. And I said, that's a fish sandwich, but you don't know what kind of fish it is. That sounds, like you can't just eat a fish sandwich. It's just as if it's just a general seagoing animal. And he was like, no, it's just delicious, Mr. Bridges. And I was like, well, okay. But this kid, he went back to McDonald's the next day, and he bought another fish sandwich, but he asked and then went online to find out what fish it was, and it was, New England farmed cod or something like this. And he said, see, Mr. Bridges, I know about my food now. And I was like, that's great. But there is a level of consciousness, that on the one hand might ruin the food that you eat if you know so much about it.
Yeah.
It might be a little exhausting. On the other hand, that level of consciousness might make you more invested in it, right? In the stories that come with it. Like, this dish was my grandmother's. That's a potent story, right? Or this chicken that I'm eating came from, this farm. Or something along those lines. And you can get to extremes with that, for sure. But the knowing and being conscious of our stories about the food that we eat can raise that potency a little bit.
I agree. And, I bought a cookbook that is filled with recipes from grandmothers from countries around the world. And I've been trying a few out. Some of them, and my wife's gluten intolerant, so some of them I got to do extra work to make it happen. But it's fun to cook something and then talk to the kids about where the recipe comes from. Right. And let's name this spot on the map, because all kids need help with geography these days, and somehow feeling a little bit more connected to it. I mean, I remember how Max, our middle son, delighted at it was a chicken recipe from Zambia, and that all of a sudden he had this Zambian connection, and it was like he was eating this chicken, like almost in a Black Panther-ish way. The movie Black Panther, not the, so there's this pride that wells up in the sense of this Africanness of the dish that he wouldn't have had we not shared that story. Let's see, maybe one more question. Yes?
I think we can all profit from more integrated congregations. We are so segregated Sunday mornings. And I discussed this with a black kindergarten teacher and said, how? Because when we moved here from California, we looked for a more integrated congregation. And I asked, why is this so? She said, well, for one thing, I take my knitting, and our services are a minimum of 3 hours. Well, I would not like it if Justin went on for 3 hours. But how can we strive to have more integrated congregations, given the different view of what goes on Sunday morning.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. You know, the integrating congregations is not only about a diverse group of people sitting in a space. You know, integration or inclusion means other things, and what we sometimes, so if we assume that a university church's life is acultural, like it has no culture. So like this is standard Methodist worship. This is what worship is. And what I'd like to say is that we actually, the entirety of our worship service is a cultural experience. Absolutely is. As robustly a cultural experience as a Korean Methodist worship service is a cultural experience, or an African American worship service is a cultural experience. And so to the degree that you feel comfortable going to a Korean Methodist worship service, again, still Methodist, still similar-ish, with all the different Korean things going on, is the same degree as somebody would feel very comfortable entering into this. But the assumption that we have is that this is culturally neutral and therefore an absolutely hospitable place for everybody. And that is one thing, that's another place of interrogation. We've got to say, no, we've got to name all the ways that there's layers of cultural activity that happen at University United Methodist Church that might be a barrier somebody might need to move through or go over or around in order to feel at home here. And the more that we can be aware of that and to name that, we might actually stand a better chance of inviting people into the space in more healthy ways. So if you were here last week, Bishop Willimon said that sometimes we might just need to ask people to be missionaries into our space. Hey, friend, I know you're part of a different cultural context, but if you will come here on purpose, knowing that it's going to be uncomfortable to you, but please be a missionary to us and help us grow in our spirituality and our sense of others. Maybe that's the kind of ask that enables somebody to be a part of this with us. And if you ask someone to do that, so noting that it's not going to be like the other kinds of church experiences they may have had in the past, and then if we're in conversation about, okay, so what was resonant to you and what was not, what was comfortable to you here and what was absolutely not, then we understand something more about ourselves and maybe find ways to be more hospitable to others. But so when I talk about the hard work of developing more inclusive churches, in Houston, the Houston experience, I mean, it went from a primarily Anglo congregation, and then in 7 years was a multicultural congregation in this spot. And that was constant discovery about the underlying cultural assumptions of our service and the ones that had to be nuanced in order for other people to be present with us. And I gotta tell you, it's more work than we thought, because my congregation thought this is just a normal worship service that everybody should feel infinitely comfortable being a part of, until we started to really wrestle with that. So it can be a great experience, but you have to start naming some of those things.
I was going to say, like, part of that naming too is for white people as well, to name the privilege and power in a culture that is dominated, by white power and privilege, and be able to say, just inviting somebody else who's different from me into my white powerful, privileged place might not be the thing. Maybe I need to put my privilege and my power at the foot of the cross and say, as a Christian, I'm going to go be subject to you. I'm going to go to your service, and whether it's 3 hours or whether it's 15 minutes, I'm going to sit at your feet and say, I want to learn your story. I want to eat at your table. I want to sing your songs. And that unraveling of my white power and privilege and might be the way an entrance into some of those conversations. And my church is learning this, and we have traditional connections to African American churches in Durham, and we're a very well-meaning congregation, and we're working on doing those things. But it's a difficult thing to think, that we might not have all the answers, that we might not have the answers that are going to hear well or be received well at an African American congregation or at a Latino congregation. And just having us start a program and say, well, we're going to do this program and we're going to do it like this. And they're going to be like, well, that's the rest of my life, man. Like, I live in a white person's world. I don't need to do this. I need those 3 hours every Sunday to remind myself as an African American person that Jesus still loves me, because the rest of my life is like this. So, as a white person, I'm always conscious of that and working to sort of peel that away as best I can when I enter into those conversations, and when I enter into, conversations or connections or worship with my friends at Mount Level, or my friend at St. Joe's, or my friends at Iglesia Manuel, that I don't, I'm just not this neutral party here, but I need to lay all that stuff at the cross in order to have that connection.
That's right. I love that. My goodness. Okay, so we just got to close because we could do this all afternoon. Thanks, Matt, for being here.
Yeah,
and I hope you'll come next week. Next week we're talking about race and education, and this is a very important conversation for our town and our public school system that has the second largest education gap between white and black students in the country, and the fifth largest between white and Hispanic students in the country. And so we're going to talk about some gritty conversations that are going to be fairly close to home. So I hope you will come back next week. Thank you.